那你一般会就转站吗？
转啊！
嗯，好。那
为什么在笑啊？
你为什么在笑啊？
Here is the following evidence for 5 experiment trials and a discussion we had to improve the accuracy of the experiments. The population of the subjects we chose were people from our age, and to fully test if conformity works, we had selected test subjects from both genders, different grades, school, and cultural backgrounds, since the level of conformity might differ according to all these aspects. The first subject we selected was David. The reason we've given him to be part of the experiment was that he was to be waiting in the Zoom meeting for an interview. However, what he didn't know was that we were recording the session and seeing if he would conform to the group's actions. The interview didn't exist at all. The experiment started off awkwardly, and our groupmate, Anthony, controlling the bell and the direction of the experiment, decided to resolve this awkwardness by asking David questions about the upcoming interview.
Dachi, you still with us?
啊，咋了
You still with us?
？Yes。
Okay, great.
However, the process was dry and awkward, with the subject not conforming to the majority. During the experiment, the subject was confused by why we were turning our cameras on and off, while he was also constantly looking down and not paying attention to the screen. When the subject gained the acknowledgement of the actions of the majority, he becomes partly known to the purpose of the meeting, since he had recognized that we were doing something out of the ordinary. Therefore, the subject with this acknowledgement would most likely not conform but question the motives of the actors.
What are you guys even doing？你们在说？你们在那个什么那个叫什么天想不起来了。做礼拜似的，你们几个。
In the end, the experiment was a letdown, considering that the subject didn't conform. Through the results of the first experiment, we decided to improve our experiment method. And the improvement is that we will change the reason that we will tell the subject. Instead of telling the subject that they will be waiting in the Zoom waiting room, we will survey the subject instead about the Beijing subway system. And throughout this duration, the experiment will be conducted. The reasons for this change was to create a much more natural environment, so the ringing bell isn't forced upon the subject, and the subject wouldn't know the true purpose of the meeting. Then, in the second experiment, the subject we chose was Biffin from grade 9, and after introducing him to the group and starting the survey, the ringing began.
关于北京地铁的问题，然后就切入就好。
那我是用中文还是英文？
中文呀，
都行，
都是中国人。
行。
那么你平时乘地铁吗？
啊？
During this process, we could see that the subject didn't conform to the rest of the group members. The test subject seems to be confused by the bell ringing and the action that is accompanied by it.
那就你是说，那么你觉得就是你要是坐地铁，或为什么就是你会选择坐地铁，而不是选择其他的，就是坐你自己家的车或者坐公交车这些其他的交通方式？
环保一点吧。
而
且方便一点，不会堵车。
好。那你一般坐地铁你会花多少钱？是买票还是用你的卡？
买票。
那你是 就你能描述一下，就你一般上学就是会就从你
This same reaction is continued without the act of conforming to the group.
一开始上学那个站，然后或者转站或者不转站，然后最后到学校，然后差不多是一个什么情况吗？
我上学不坐地铁，
就是像尽量描述一下，就是人多不多，或者你自己就是走动的这样流畅不流畅这样的东西。
我不坐地铁上学。
Eventually, the experiment reached its end. The results were not as expected. The test subject didn't conform to the experiment. In order to find out why the experiment didn't work, we concluded two possible reasons. The first one is that the bell ringing wasn't as loud, and so the subject didn't notice or wasn't affected in any psychological way. If the sound of the bell was to be louder, it would have a much forceful effect on the subject. Secondly, the survey's lack of open-ended questions might have resulted in the subject's inattentiveness, leading to the subject ignoring the bell. With that in mind, we conducted our third attempt. The results of the third trial were similar to the results of the second trial. The test subject didn't conform to the majority except for the last bell ring, which was slightly better than the results of the previous trials.
我觉得最多对我来说的话是跟单吧。
差不多。我觉得回答挺好。
那么我们现在的 survey 就到此为止了啊。谢谢 ，Thank you for the participation。
谢谢彤彤，那个我们 leave 了，然后我再跟他说几声话。
However, we couldn't conclude that the experiment had shown the effect of conformity because the subject being conformed to the action once doesn't provide sufficient proof. At this point, the team is faced with a problem. The experiment isn't proving the effects of conformity. The process is painful and dry for both the experimenters and experimentees. But the results of the upcoming fourth trial we will be conducting will prove to be significantly helpful. Here's what happened. At the start of the experiment, the subject questioned our actions, which wasn't as planned. During the process, the subject questioned us again and seemed to be confused. In order to continue the experiment, we had to move on with the questions and see if the subject would conform to the actions of the majority. The process was very similar to the other three trials, and the subject didn't conform to the majority.
比如说像什么人太多啊、票太贵啊什么的，有没有感觉到这样的问题？
可以吧？哎，你们为什么那个一会儿就关摄像头，一会儿就
你是就觉得从你的角度看来，就反正挺正常的，就。
During the experiment, some of the experimenters were also laughing, which was pointed out by the subject.
乘坐就是几号线呢
14和1。
嗯，
为什么在笑啊？
你为什么在笑啊？
不是棒棒和 Maggie 们都在笑。
This had made the subject aware of a hidden intention of the survey, and thus that may be one of the reasons that the subject didn't conform. In the end, when the subject was told about the experiment, she said that she noticed the survey was a cover-up. However, the experiment itself wasn't the most significant part that helped the group. It was the feedback.
就是你们如果想测这种从众心理的话，你不应该只设一个回答问题的人，就你如果让 Maggie、Dana 他们都变成回答问题，就是被受采访的那一方，然后他们如果都会逐渐的关掉的话，那我可能也会关掉。但是因为我知道你们全都是来问我的人，所以你们如果关了，我不会觉得我也应该关，因为你们是一个群体，而我跟你们是一个 separate 的群体 ，if that makes sense.
The subject said that there shouldn't be just one interviewee, because when there is more than one interviewee, the subject will identify herself as a group with that interviewee. As a result, when her groupmate turns off their camera, then the subject would feel much more pressure to do so as well, and therefore achieving conformity. This feedback was very important to the process of testing conformity, because it had changed a huge part of the experiment process, which could be seen in the fourth and final experiment. However, before we continue, the group thought of things to improve, and that includes First, the subject shouldn't be people that are familiar with us, because then the amount of pressure will decrease, and without the pressure, the desire to conform would decrease as well. The second one is that the experimenters shouldn't laugh during the experiment. And the third one is that we should make the subject identify with a group, so to increase the power of conformity. The fifth experiment, after receiving feedback from Christina, we has changed the interviewer and interviewee format into a free discussion group.
就你们尽量每个人都答。
So we're acting like a 自由讨论，你是意思？
对 ，yes。然后那个 Jerry 你来。
So that the subject could identify himself with the entire group and therefore would feel much more pressured to conform. Unfortunately, the experiment didn't go as planned. During the experiment, the subject seems to be rather confused when we closed our cameras, and that the experiment also lacked the discussion feel to it. It was rather like an interviewer going around interviewing each person.
这样，帮忙吧，你平时是坐地铁，我知道吧？那么汉文，你平时坐地铁吗？
平时基本不坐地铁。
那么下一个的话，我问 Maggie 吧。Maggie。Hello。啊，那。
However, the subject did close his camera during the discussion once, which is not enough to prove conformity.
那你是为什么会选择乘坐地铁呢？
In the end, when we told our subject about the experiment, he said that he knew something was wrong, and that he thought it was his internet connection when we closed our cameras.
不是，我其实觉得我开始以为是 internet connection 的有问题。I don't know about the microphone thing going on with one of you guys. 但我知道你
microphone thing. We didn't plan the microphone thing.
The subject also thought that the bell was unintentional. He said that he believed someone just forgot to turn their microphones off.
你听那个
bell 不是故意。我听了那个 bell， 我这是谁呀？怎么没关麦呀？
这个相机没有 zoom 的好看，zoom 的更加模糊，颗粒感更加的强。
谁是89？
这是你在干什么？
After the 4 experiments, the group had a discussion on what should be done next and what should be improved. One of the main problems that we identified is the fact that the experiment takes place on the internet, so the subject would likely connect the action of turning our cameras on and off due to bad internet connection.
你还可以 justify 这跟那个网络还有关系，它不只有 它不只跟什么别的东西 conformity， 还会跟 internet， 就是说 whether it's virtual 和不 virtual 有关系。
可以这么说吧。
Finally, we decided to implement Plan B, because the Zoom conformity experiment doesn't seem to be working. Plan B is similar to the Ashline conformity experiment, where we would replace the lines into simple mathematical equations.
或者其实可以就是线，但是我们不用线，可以弄那种数学公式。就假如说 2x 等于4，然后 x 等于多少？然后就是有一帮人，就有一帮人，他们就是先是说这个正确答案 x 等于2，然后最后呢，最后几道题以后，他们就开始说错误答案了，然后看那一个 subject，看他会不会 conform。
OK， 这个不错。
Unfortunately, Plan B was unable to be implemented because online school started. In conclusion, even though the experiments wasn't able to show the effects of conformity, it was still very rewarding for the group to see what went wrong and improve on the experiment method. After every experiment, the group was able to concisely identify the mistakes and fix them in the upcoming experiments, which could be seen after every trial, where we created a list of things to improve. It was also very interesting to listen to the subject's perspective on the experiment, and it turns out to be the most helpful when we listen to their feedback, either if it is commenting on the confusion or suggesting a different way to approach conformity. Of course, we couldn't end the video but to give a shout out to Maggie and Dana for helping to conduct the experiments.
我们都是 actors.
You should win a group performance.